trucks crossing the U.S.-Canada border through BC to Alaska could be facing extra fees in the future. While Premier David Eby has mentioned the idea before, this time he's taking serious action.
Since Donald Trump got back in the White House, he has unleashed a wave of executive orders aimed squarely at Canada, aiming at their lumber, dairy, and steel. He believed a fresh onslaught of tariffs would force Canada into submission, but he failed to realize just how differently his northern neighbor now plays the game. This was no longer the quiet ally from his previous tenure. Instead, Canada struck back openly and aggressively. Premier David Eby in British Columbia went straight for the jugular by proposing tolls on trucks entering Alaska from the mainland United States. It was an audacious move, one that turned America's largest state into a bargaining chip. Trump roared from his podium, calling it illegal and hostile. Yet deep down, even his advisors knew the hard truth. You can dodge tariffs with creative accounting, but you cannot dodge geography. See, Canada had found its pressure point, and it was called Alaska, the U.S. state that's actually more Canadian than you think. When you look at Alaska, the first things that come to mind are the snow-capped mountains, bald eagles, and the northern lights shimmering over frozen forests, a symbol of rugged American independence. But when you look closer at a map, that image begins to unravel. Because while Alaska may belong to the United States in every legal sense, in terms of infrastructure and access, the state is deeply entangled with its Canadian neighbor. Alaska is not physically connected to the continental United States. There is no direct road, no train line, no pipeline, and no uninterrupted flight path that avoids Canadian territory. To move anything from the lower 48 to Alaska, whether it is groceries, gasoline, or construction materials, you must go through Canada. That means land shipments rely on roads carved through the Yukon Territory and British Columbia. Even maritime shipping routes pass through Canadian-controlled waters. And yes, even airplanes flying from Seattle or Denver to Anchorage often require permission to cross Canadian airspace. It is not just symbolic, it is structural. There are only two American states that are not part of the contiguous mainland, Hawaii and Alaska. But unlike Hawaii, which is entirely surrounded by ocean and accessible only by ship or plane, Alaska pretends to be connected. The illusion breaks when you realize that every truckload of produce or fuel bound for Fairbanks must first get stamped at a Canadian customs checkpoint. Every Alaskan cruise ship leaving port in Juneau sails through Canadian waters before reaching the Pacific. Every flight rerouted due to a storm over the Rockies likely needs to communicate with Canadian air traffic control. And that is where Canada's leverage becomes not only strategic, but unavoidable. Alaska is not just dependent on the lower 48. It is dependent on the goodwill of the country that stands between them. A country that, as of now, is furious. But here is where things get very interesting. Because you see, Canada is a very vital country for the survival of Alaska because of one province in particular. And right now, Canada is talking about how to best use this situation. And it doesn't look good for the United States. But before we get into that, subscribe. How British Columbia just became the power broker of the West. British Columbia is not typically seen as a global player. It is a province known for its scenic coastline, high cost of living, and eco-conscious cities like Vancouver and Victoria. But thanks to this crisis, British Columbia now finds itself in a position of extraordinary influence. It is the physical bottleneck through which almost every land-based shipment to Alaska must travel, and Premier David Eby knows it. What makes British Columbia so powerful in this moment is not just its roads, but its ports, its air corridors, and its political autonomy. In Canada's federal structure, provinces hold significant sway over infrastructure policies within their borders. That means Eby can impose tolls, inspection delays, or regulatory requirements on trucks moving through the province without needing Ottawa's immediate approval. And he is using that power. In interviews, Eby has not shied away from the symbolism of his actions. If the United States raises the cost of doing business with Canada, he said, then we reserve the right to raise the cost of doing business with the United States. It was not just political theater. It was the language of hardball geopolitics. Coming from a province better known for salmon fisheries and ski resorts, it caught many off guard. But not everyone is surprised. Policy experts have long warned that British Columbia's location makes it a geopolitical pressure point in any North American dispute. And now, with Trump's policies reigniting tensions, those warnings are proving prophetic. The tolls that could collapse Alaska's economy. As outlined by Premier Eby, the new plan would apply toll fees specifically to commercial trucks hauling goods from the continental United States to Alaska. These trucks typically move everything from produce to heavy equipment, with few viable alternatives. Barges are slow, air freight is costly, and winter conditions make supply delays more than just inconvenient. They become dangerous. Eby claims the tolls are temporary, a retaliatory measure meant to pressure Washington into dropping Trump's tariffs. But industry analysts are not convinced. If enacted, these fees could raise the cost of shipping by thousands of dollars per load, especially for time-sensitive goods. That cost will not be absorbed by freight companies. It will be passed directly to the people of Alaska. Alaska already has one of the highest costs of living in North America. Add tolls, and that gap widens. Fuel prices, already volatile, could surge. Grocery bills would climb. Local construction projects could stall. And the state's limited industrial base means there is no fallback supply. This is not a symbolic gesture. It is a targeted, precision strike at the economic artery of an isolated state. And as Trump ramps up his trade war with new rounds of tariffs, Canada is making it clear two can play this game. Because when geography becomes a weapon, no tariff is safe. And no state, not even one draped in American flags, is out of reach. So what happens when a domestic trade policy pushes a foreign nation to hit back at your own backyard? The answer lies not in Washington, and not even in Ottawa. It lies in a place most Americans never think about. Welcome to the geopolitical flashpoint known as Alaska, the Alaska Highway Crisis. There is an international treaty at risk, and President Donald Trump is ready to tear it apart. When Canada threatened to impose tolls on trucks traveling along the Alaska Highway, the issue didn't just spark an economic debate. It cracked open an old diplomatic agreement that once symbolized post-war cooperation. That agreement, a treaty signed in the year 1977 between the United States and Canada, which explicitly bans any tolls on the Alaska Highway when used for transporting goods. But in this new chapter of trade warfare, that ink on paper is now being treated like a provocation, and Trump isn't having it. The Alaska Highway is more than just a road. It's a 1,387-mile lifeline connecting the continental United States to its most remote state. Built during World War II as a joint military route, it stretches across some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth, from Dawson Creek in British Columbia to Delta Junction in central Alaska. Under the terms of the treaty, the Canadian government agreed not to impose any tolls, fees, or other restrictions on this vital corridor. In exchange, the United States would continue funding its maintenance and infrastructure upgrades. But now, British Columbia's Premier David Eby is preparing to test the limits of that agreement. By threatening tolls on commercial trucks using the highway to reach Alaska, Eby has drawn fire not only from American truckers and businesses, but directly from the Oval Office. Trump, known for his zero-sum approach to diplomacy, has made it clear. If Canada breaks the treaty, there will be consequences. During a press briefing held at the White House, Trump thundered, "This treaty is crystal clear. Canada signed it, we honored it, and now they want to charge our truckers like we're just some other country. That's not going to happen under my watch." White House staff reportedly began preparing retaliatory legal actions, including the possibility of freezing infrastructure cooperation funds and reviewing all cross-border treaties for possible leverage. Inside the West Wing, sources say Trump is considering revoking certain trade exemptions that benefit Canadian ports. This would be a dramatic escalation, one that could upend not just Alaska's access routes, but the broader spirit of cooperation that has long defined the northern border. At the heart of the legal issue is Article 2 of the treaty, which states Canada will not impose any highway toll or permit any such toll to be charged for the use of such highways by vehicles or persons. Legal scholars from both countries are now combing through this clause, each side looking for a loophole or technicality to exploit. Trump's legal advisors argue that any action to implement tolls would not only breach international law, but also undermine existing commercial transit protections guaranteed under the North American Free Trade Agreement replacement. Canada, meanwhile, insists that the proposed tolls are technically outside the treaty's scope. British Columbia's government claims the tolls would apply only to new segments of highway infrastructure not directly covered under the original terms. But Trump is not interested in technicalities. He sees the move as a direct affront, both to American sovereignty and to his leadership. The tension has reached the point where U.S. Customs and Border Protection agents have been instructed to monitor any infrastructure developments on Canadian roads leading into Alaska. Behind closed doors, Canadian officials have expressed concern that if Trump proceeds with retaliatory trade restrictions, it could create a rift that lasts well beyond his presidency. But for Trump, This is personal. It is not just about keeping promises or defending trade. It is about power, pride, and proving that America still calls the shots. As he recently posted on his social media platform, "If Canada wants to play tough, we'll show them what tough really looks like. No tolls, no tricks, just America first." Trump's posturing has only deepened the divide. Canadian diplomats have so far avoided responding in kind, but the silence is strategic. The pressure is building, and it is only a matter of time before this legal standoff turns into a full-blown trade skirmish. David Eby versus Donald Trump. This is not just a trade dispute anymore. It is a full-blown war of egos. On one side, Donald Trump, the unpredictable and unrelenting president of the United States. On the other, David Eby, the rising star premier of British Columbia, determined to protect his province from economic fallout. The stage is not a courtroom or a negotiating table. It is the global spotlight, and neither man seems willing to back down. Their clash began as a response to Trump's reintroduction of tariffs on Canadian steel, lumber, and agricultural products. But when Premier Eby floated the idea of tolling American trucks headed to Alaska, things escalated quickly. Trump blasted Eby by name during a rally in Anchorage, calling him a weak provincial bureaucrat trying to shake down America. In return, Eby responded with a press conference that was more a declaration of defiance than diplomacy. British Columbia will not be bullied. We will defend our rights, our economy, and our dignity. What started as a policy debate has morphed into symbolic warfare. Trump has positioned himself as the defender of American independence, while Eby has emerged as the face of Canadian resistance. Political analysts on both sides agree this is no longer just about tariffs or tolls. It is about national pride, and that makes compromise even harder. With each public insult, each retaliatory move, and each media headline, the space for peaceful resolution shrinks. But for the border communities stuck in the middle, the clash of titans is becoming more than political theater. It is threatening their very way of life. When border towns become bargaining chips, small towns like Hyder, Skagway, and Haines have become the unintentional victims of a geopolitical feud that has nothing to do with them. Hyder, for example, is so isolated from the rest of Alaska that the only way in or out is through Stewart, British Columbia. Residents rely on Canadian roads, Canadian cell towers, even Canadian emergency services. Skagway and Haines, while slightly more connected, still depend on seamless land access through Canada for everything from groceries to medical supplies. When Trump's tariffs hit and Eby's toll proposal emerged, these communities braced for impact. Business owners have reported shipment delays, higher fuel costs, and declining tourism as news of the standoff spreads. One hotel owner in Haines said, "Our summer season is already short. If people think it's going to be a hassle to get here, they'll just stay away." Local governments are pleading for calm. Mayors and council members have written joint letters to both Washington and Victoria, urging their leaders to de-escalate. But they are not naive. They know that once small towns become bargaining chips, they are rarely the first priority. Residents have begun stockpiling essentials. Some are considering leaving altogether. The uncertainty is corrosive and growing. But while these border towns may be small in size, they represent something far bigger, the fragile human thread that binds two powerful nations together. And that thread is starting to fray. America's northernmost state relies on a delicate network of trucking, shipping, and overflight routes through Canadian territory. With retaliatory tolls looming, freight companies report mounting delays and costs. Winter is fast approaching, raising fears of potential shortages in heating oil, food, and construction materials. The land lockdown that could paralyze a United States state. It would not require tanks or military forces for Canada to leave Alaska stranded. With a single announcement at key crossing points, Canada could bar overland access and isolate an entire region of the United States. Drivers approaching the border might discover closures that send them turning back toward winding routes or crossing points that no longer admit commercial freight. That scenario is not science fiction. It is a real possibility in a world where trade disputes escalate under President Donald Trump's renewed tariffs. Canada has already signaled it can respond in ways that move beyond routine economic pushback. Closing highways could serve as a targeted strike that affects Americans on a daily level. Much of Alaska's road-based trade flows through British Columbia and Yukon territory, providing everything from produce to machinery. If Canadian officials chose to shut the land corridor, Alaskans would watch prices surge on goods that suddenly require air or ocean transport. Towns near the border would see their lifelines evaporate. Local residents who routinely drive south for a doctor's visit or family gathering might lose that privilege overnight. David Eby, the Premier of British Columbia, has described these dramatic steps as undesirable, but has hinted he will do whatever it takes to safeguard Canadian interests. Of course, Canada would not close the door on Alaska without repercussions for its own communities. Cross-border commerce also benefits Canadian businesses, and any broad shutdown would be painful on both sides. Yet, frustration with President Trump's directives runs high, and some Canadians view drastic action as necessary to demonstrate that no part of the United States can ignore economic retaliation. The legal underpinnings, such as long-standing treaties about the Alaska Highway, present their own complexities. Even so, documents can be reinterpreted or contested if political resolve is strong enough. This means that a land lockdown, though extreme, remains within the realm of possibility. And if land corridors can be closed, what about the crucial waterways that connect Alaska to the rest of North America? That question leads to a new kind of tension, one that dives straight into the heart of maritime routes. Alaska's ocean lifeline is at Canada's mercy. Water has always served as Alaska's most important highway, especially for remote communities reachable only by boat. Tourists flock to scenic routes, and freight vessels carry everything from fuel to fresh produce. However, most of these ships cannot avoid traveling through Canadian waters. The Inside Passage, a protected network of channels and fjords, keeps cargo ships safe from rough seas. Cruise liners also rely on this calm route, stopping at Canadian ports before continuing north. If Canada decided to block or restrict this passage, the effect on Alaska's tourism, trade, and everyday life would be profound. In theory, ships could bypass Canadian waters by venturing out to the open ocean. Yet such a detour adds costs, time, and risk. Foul weather or lack of sheltered harbors can make these alternative routes unattractive. For cruise lines, skipping the scenic passages would ruin a major selling point. For cargo operators, the longer journey would mean rising fuel prices and scheduling nightmares. In a fierce trade conflict, Canada might impose new fees, permits, or environmental regulations to slow maritime traffic and increase expenses for American shippers. Vessel captains could find themselves needing extra clearance paperwork. Cruisers excited to see Alaska's glaciers might lose a stop in Vancouver, British Columbia. Meanwhile, tourism authorities in Alaska would face cancellations. To make matters worse, ferry terminals such as Prince Rupert serve as crucial connections between coastal towns. If these facilities were shut, Alaskans relying on ferry services for doctor appointments, school events, or family visits would be forced to look for expensive flights. Canada does have reasons to be cautious. Taking steps to block the Inside Passage could harm Canadian ports that prosper from tourist dollars. Furthermore, some Canadian citizens work in industries tied to Alaska's maritime economy. However, if President Trump continues to push aggressive tariff policies that sting Canadian producers, voices calling for stronger retaliation might drown out moderation. What remains is a growing question. If land routes and ocean lanes can be used as bargaining chips, could Canada go even further and touch the skies? What if Canada shut down the sky? Commercial airlines and cargo planes often soar from the mainland United States across Canadian airspace en route to major Alaskan destinations like Anchorage or Fairbanks. This flight path has long been a standard and uncontroversial part of North American air travel, upheld through mutual agreements between the two nations. For years, the arrangement has stood as a quiet symbol of cross-border cooperation, where overflight rights are granted with little fanfare and minimal friction. These permissions have enabled steady passenger travel and reliable cargo shipments, forming a critical link between Alaska and the rest of the United States. However, if Canada's government were to suddenly deny or even heavily restrict those overflights, the consequences would be immediate. Air carriers, which rely on efficient and predictable routes, would be forced to rapidly adjust their flight paths. In doing so, they would face only a few options, most notably diverting flights over the Arctic Circle or the wide Pacific Ocean. Yet both alternatives come with significant downsides. These detours add substantial fuel costs, increase flight times, and reduce access to emergency landing sites. For airlines already operating on thin margins, the financial strain would be considerable. In normal circumstances, such a restriction would be unthinkable. Both the United States and Canada benefit from open skies agreements, which support passenger travel, cargo delivery, and even joint military operations in the north. But President Trump's aggressive tariff policies have reignited economic tensions, leaving Canadian leaders under pressure to consider stronger responses. Among the most effective forms of retaliation would be the disruption of Alaska's supply routes, one channel at a time. And while denying overflight rights might not make headlines like closing a land border or seizing cargo, it would create major logistical complications for airlines and freight companies alike. The fallout would stretch beyond the airline industry. Ticket prices would likely rise for flights between Alaska and the lower 48 states, hitting Alaskan residents who already face high travel costs. Freight carriers could be forced to reduce cargo capacity or delay shipments, affecting the availability of essential items like medical equipment, fresh food, or construction materials. For remote communities that rely on air service for basic goods, the impact would be especially severe. Military concerns would also grow. Alaska is home to critical United States defense infrastructure. If Canada began interfering with overflights by U.S. Air Force aircraft, even indirectly, it would raise serious questions inside the Pentagon. Despite decades of alliance, direct interference in military logistics would mark a sharp escalation. Canada might ultimately avoid such a move, knowing the backlash could be severe. Still, the possibility remains. And as long as trade disputes persist, the threat of airspace restrictions continues to hang over Alaska. Quiet but very real. With skies potentially in play, observers are left wondering if overflights can be weaponized. Are rail lines and port cargo next in line? Trains, ports, and the quiet collapse of cross-border trade. Alaska's link to the mainland United States is not confined to roads, ferries, and flight routes. Rail networks in Western Canada carry everything from raw materials to finished products. Ports in British Columbia, especially the massive facilities around Vancouver, form a gateway where ships bound for Alaska load and unload. If these key hubs were slowed or shut through punitive regulations, tariff hikes, or worker strikes spurred by political pressure, the flow of goods could come to a virtual standstill. Train shipments that run through Canadian territory could be forced to comply with tighter inspections. Freight might languish in rail yards as bureaucratic delays mount. Overworked customs agents could cause days of backlogged cargo. Meanwhile, port operations, already complex, would see new red tape regarding American shipments destined for Alaska. In time, shelves in Anchorage and Juneau might empty of certain goods, leading to price spikes that make daily life even tougher. President Trump, having championed the tariffs that triggered Canada's backlash, would face heightened criticism from Alaskans who feel abandoned by Washington. In defending his stance, he might levy more tariffs on Canadian steel or lumber, prompting further retaliation. Both sides would find themselves in a spiral of measures and countermeasures, with Alaskan livelihoods caught in the middle. To Canadians, turning port or rail traffic into a tool of foreign policy is not without cost. Local businesses rely on smooth trade to maintain profits, and workers in Vancouver or Prince Rupert do not wish to lose their paychecks. Yet as pressure builds, some citizens believe that meeting tariff aggression with proportional force is the only way to catch Washington's attention. When rail cars sit idle and cargo ships depart half-empty, the real impact ripples from factories to families. The conflict ceases to be a televised war of words and becomes an economic grind felt in everyday transactions. By the time all these supply lines, land, sea, air, and rail, are under threat, the question turns to broader consequences beyond Alaska's borders. Will other provinces join the standoff? Will President Donald Trump choose negotiation or escalation? The answers remain in flux, but for now, one thing is certain. Alaska's future hangs on a fragile web of routes that Canada can tighten or loosen at will. This standoff transcends politics and touches the everyday reality of families, communities, and entire industries. As each side weighs its next move, the fate of Alaska and the dynamics of cross-border life rest on precarious negotiations. In times like these, individuals' voices can help shape policy. Do you see a compromise on the horizon, or is an even bigger confrontation looming? Whether you live in Anchorage, Vancouver, or anywhere else, your opinion matters. Share your thoughts in the comments section down below and let the conversation begin today. Thanks for watching till the end.